Thank you. Now, I have a special guest who's going to help me introduce tonight's speakers. Rod Eaton of the Underbeats, one of the bands that is profiled by tonight's speakers. All right. It began with some trash men talking about a bird, and things snowballed from there.
Rather than read that, let me just say a couple of things really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I did play with the Underbeats in the 1960s, and then I went on to TC Atlantic, and I felt really fortunate to be able to live through that period of time. It was an exciting one. And I've read both of the books that you're going to see tonight, and I think they do a tremendous job of illuminating what an exciting period of time that was, what a vibrant time that was musically here in the Twin Cities, and how it laid the foundation, I think, for the bands that followed us in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I'm excited to hear both of them talk, and I know you will be too. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. It began with some trash men talking about a bird, and things snowballed from there. For the ascendancy of Prince, Husker Du, The Replacements, and others. Minneapolis unexpectedly crashed the national rock scene with a catchy Surfin' Bird, which stuck in the ear of hundreds of thousands of teens and getting them moving on the dance floor, and other local bands followed in their wake. Simultaneously, a groovy R&B and jazz scene arose on both sides of the river, beginning with Augie Garcia and the Amazers, and progressing to a Minneapolis original. Rick Shefchik and Andrea Swensson are here tonight to talk about their books, Everybody's Heard About the Bird, and Got to Be Something Here, which chronicle the local music scene and the famous Minneapolis Sound from the 1960s to the early 80s and beyond. Let's rock!
Thank you. Am I projecting okay with this mic? Does it sound good? All right, thanks very much. I'm Rick Shefchik. I wrote Everybody's Heard About the Bird, the true story of 1960s rock and roll in Minnesota. But I knew I was going to do that. But to tell that story, you actually have to go back to the 50s. And Augie Garcia is sort of the wellspring of Minnesota rock and roll. He was a resident of St. Paul's West Side, grew up in the Hispanic community, went to the Korean War, discovered both Fats Domino and wearing shorts while he was in the service, and came back and decided to put together a rock and roll band. Really hadn't been done at all in Minneapolis or St. Paul. And Augie created a sensation, playing primarily at the River Road Club in Mendota Heights. People flocked from all over the Twin Cities to see him. You can see an example here on the slide behind me that Augie was a showman. He was on the piano. He was on the floor on his back. He would do whatever it took to get the crowd going. And at the piano, this is a sort of a nice tie-in to Andrea's book. That's Cornbread Harris, who is Jimmy Jam Harris's father. This is really where the scene got started. Augie was so exciting and drew such a crowd that when Elvis Presley made his 1956 debut at the St. Paul Auditorium, a majority of the crowd there was there to see Augie because he opened for Elvis. And 3 songs into the set, Colonel Tom Parker hooked him off the stage because he was creating too much of a sensation. Yeah, that was the Colonel. But, you know, Augie recorded a few records, but they really didn't get a whole lot of airplay in the Twin Cities because essentially he was ahead of his time. What was going on in the local recording scene back then was mostly polka bands and little jazz combos making records for their small followings. They weren't getting airplay in the Twin Cities either, but they were recording at a recording studio in Minneapolis called K Bank, owned by Vern Bank and named after his wife Kay. It had actually been started by Bruce Swedian, who went on to do a lot of engineering for Quincy Jones, worked on the Michael Jackson albums, but he didn't do any rock and roll recording when he owned the studio. That only got started once Vern Bank took it over and renamed it K Bank. This is typical of what was being recorded at K Bank at the time. This is, this is the Eddie Skeets in his orchestra, which didn't really set the charts on fire. The first true rock and roll record made at K Bank was by Bobby V, who came from North Dakota. And we're all familiar with the story about how Bobby V filled in on stage when Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Ritchie Valens died in a plane crash, and they were scheduled to perform that night in North Dakota, and they sent out a request for local bands to fill in, which is just unheard of. You cannot imagine today an artist of Buddy Holly's stature dying and then, listening to the radio and saying, "Are there any bands that want to come in and fill in?" But that's what they did, and Bobby V and his brother Bill had a band, and they played several songs. They went over very well, and they started gigging around western Minnesota and the Dakotas, and Bobby wrote a song called Susie Baby, and they came to the Twin Cities and recorded it, and it got a lot of airplay at the Twin Cities. So this is basically the first hit and the first time that rock and roll recorded locally had cracked the local charts. And it released on the Soma label, which is owned by Amos Heilicher, and Soma is Amos spelled backwards. And Amos was into a lot of he owned the Musicland record chain. He owned jukeboxes. He was really a far-flung entrepreneur, and as far as he was concerned, a recording studio and a record label was just one of many, many things that he had his thumb into, and didn't necessarily think that it was ever going to pan out for him. But he kept recording bands, including the Fendermen, who were from Wisconsin, and they had a very small regional hit called Mule Skinner Blues, and a DJ started playing it, I think it was down in La Crosse, and it was recommended to Amos that they should put this out, and he brought them up to K Bank recording studio and re-recorded it, and it made top 10 the summer after it was recorded at K Bank, top 10 nationally. So all of a sudden Amos was thinking, well, maybe there is something in this rock and roll stuff. I'll stick with it for a little while. And in the meantime, Augie Garcia had inspired other bands to start playing rock and roll, and probably the most successful and earliest of his followers was Mike Wagner, who had a band called the Bops. Mike was originally from the Hinckley area, but moved to the Twin Cities and went to Richfield High School. And by the late 50s, he was as busy as he could possibly be, playing teen dances all over Minnesota and Wisconsin. Meanwhile, back at Soma Records, country artist and DJ Dave Dudley had a song in his back pocket that he decided to record called 6 Days on the Road, and he recorded that at Soma Records, and that became a #1 country hit in the United States. And Mercury Records approached Amos Heilicher and offered to buy his contract, so Amos sold him to Mercury and made a lot of money off of that, and Dave went on to make a lot of other top-selling country records, although 6 Days on the Road was his most successful. Golden Wing was another one of the labels that was associated with the Soma studio. Let's bump that forward. Meanwhile, nationally, what was going on is that kids were really starting to get into the electric guitar, mostly because the Ventures had their breakout hit with Walk, Don't Run in 1960. And you talk to, Rod Eaton could tell you this, but you talk to anybody who was forming a band back in that era, and you ask them, what was your primary influence? What got you into it? And you don't necessarily hear Elvis very often. You don't really hear the Everly Brothers, but you hear a lot of the Ventures. Everybody wanted to get that electric guitar and start playing like this. And it spawned hundreds of bands. Well, anyway, dozens back in 1960, but there were more coming. Bill Deal was rising to prominence on WDGY radio, hosting a lot of teen dances. This particular shot, he's at the St. Paul prom, the prom ballroom, but Bill was, again, all over the metro area, hosting dances whenever he could, and WDGY and KDWB were in a big battle for teen listeners back in the late 50s and early 60s. They were both the sort of the pioneers of the top 40 radio format, which relied heavily on rock and roll. Anyway, what we're hearing now is the precursor to the Trashmen. This was a band called Jim Thaxter and the Travelers, and three of the future Trashmen were playing in this group back in 61 and 62. And the Travelers were playing what was kind of considered to be throwback music to the late 50s, early 60s, but on the West Coast, surf music was coming in. Dick Dale and his Deltones were sort of creating a different kind of a sound, and a lot of the Twin Cities bands were starting to listen to that, including the Trashmen. Now, the Trashmen in early 1963, several of them made a trip out to the West Coast and started buying surf records. And they kind of transformed themselves into a quasi-surf band, even though, you know, they were 2,000 miles from the nearest pipeline. But that was the sound that was starting to become popular. They took a song by the Rivingtons called "The Bird's the Word," and another one that the Rivingtons did. This is a L.A. R&B group, which has nothing to do with surf, had nothing to do with Minnesota, but Steve Warrer, the drummer and lead singer of the Trashmen, heard another group from California perform this at Woodley's Country Dam and decided that this mashup of these two songs would work for their band. So they combined it into this. And Surfin' Bird was not typical of what the Trashmen were doing at the time, but it became such an enormous hit that it basically changed their lives, and it really started to change music in the Twin Cities, and you could even say was changing music nationally. They appeared on American Bandstand. They cut an album at K-Bank, and this is an example of how all of the executives at Soma and K-Bank considered them to be kind of their meal ticket. Amos was totally into rock and roll at this point. Once the Trashmen reached number 4 in the country on the charts in early 1964, and this was the Winter Carnival Spectacular in January 1964 at the St. Paul Auditorium. There were more than 20,000 kids at one point, either inside the building or trying to get in from the outside, and the Trashmen were the Trashmen were the lead act on the show. They were the headliners. And that night at this particular show, Bill Deal told them that when the next issue of Billboard came out, they were going to be number 1 in the country, jumping from number 4 to number 1. But in the following week, Billboard came out, and unfortunately, another band had passed them to become number 1. It was kind of a shock for the lads, but they were still awfully successful, and they realized that they could hit the road. They started getting booked nationally. They did lots of touring, And in the absence of the Trashmen playing everywhere all week long, once they're on the road, a number of other bands become very successful in the Twin Cities, including the Underbeats, Rod Eaton's band, the Accents, featuring I think they were also from Richfield High School, if I'm not mistaken, and Gregory D. and the Avantis. If you remember the radio from back in this era, you'll remember the grind. This was getting played constantly. And they were considered the big three. As the Trashmen were almost spending more time out of the state, these were the bands that were absolutely in highest demand here in the Twin Cities area. And some of their songs were collected on an album called Big Hits of Mid-America that came out on Soma. And this is an interesting chart here. I think this was August of 1964, where 5 of the top 50 songs on WDGY's chart were local bands. And nothing like that had ever happened before in the Twin Cities. And suddenly the 2 radio stations were competing to get these records, the local bands' records played on the air, which was just a wonderful situation for the bands. And more of them were put together, and there were more and more venues for them to play, including the Prom Ballroom, including Big Reggie's Dance Land in Excelsior. The Beach Boys played Big Reggie's and drew an enormous crowd out there just as Surfin' USA was becoming the #1 hit in the country. So Big Reggie took a swing for the fences and booked the Rolling Stones. Unfortunately, nobody had ever heard of them here in the Twin Cities. They drew about 300 people, and when the tickets moved so slowly, Big Reggie contacted Mike Wagner and the Bops and said, "Would you please come and be the opening act for the Rolling Stones?" And Mike and his band recall very clearly that when they played, all the kids were dancing, and when the Stones played, they all went out and got a Coke. We're not interested in hearing the Stones. This is another one of the venues that was really popular, Mr. Lucky's. It was a teen club. The thing to remember about the local bands back in that era were they were almost all playing for non-alcohol serving teen audiences and in teen venues. They were playing ballrooms, and they were, a lot of cases schools, but dance clubs that didn't serve alcohol. And the bar scene really wasn't much of anything. It was teen dances that was making the money for them. Magoo's was another one of the hangouts. Mr. Lucky's schedule in '63 featured the Underbeats and some of the other local bands, and then by '65, the Underbeats were still performing along with the Avantis, the Chancellors, and the Accents, and a number of other bands were coming up, sort of starting to shoulder their way into the scene.
Excuse me, why don't you point out where Mr. Lucky's was, because that's kind of in the news right now.
You're right. It's the site of what was now the former Kmart. Right, and that site again is being redeveloped. In retrospect, you kind of wish that Mr. Lucky's was still there and they'd never put a Kmart there in the first place, because it didn't really pan out for them. But other venues were the Marigold Ballroom in downtown Minneapolis, Bobby's, which became the Safari Club in Mendota Heights, the Prison in Burnsville, the Barn in Eden Prairie, the Cato Ballroom in Mankato, and that was the site where another one of the best bands in the Twin Cities, well, I should say Minnesota, came from. It was the Gestures. And they had a top 40 national hit called Run, 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 which you may remember. This is one of my personal favorites. I just think this is a great record. And again, they recorded this at K-Bank Studios in Minneapolis. The Chancellors had a #1 local hit with Little Latin Loopy Lou in '65, again recorded at K-Bank, and it came out on Soma Records. Then the Castaways hit in 1965 with a self-written song called Liar, Liar. It was #1 in the Twin Cities in the summer of 1965, but like the other local bands, the Castaways were enjoying local fame, but they were also going out of town playing various Minnesota locations. And finally, their manager called him in and said, listen, guys, we have to have a talk here. And he spread out a bunch of international and national record charts, and they were top 10 all over the country, and several other countries were playing their record constantly. He says, look at this, you're number one in Pittsburgh, you're number one in D.C., you're number 3 in Los Angeles, and where are you booked this weekend? International Falls. That's got to change. So they booked him to a West Coast trip where they ended up playing with bands like the Byrds, the Beach Boys, basically Sonny and Cher, everybody who was really big at the time. The Castaways were on the bill with all of them. High Spirits were another Twin Cities band that had a hit with Turn On Your Love Light, another one of the Soma records. And they collected a bunch more of them and put them out on Big Hits of Mid-America. And now Amos Heilicher is just raking in the cash as a rock and roll mogul. The Ravons, which were a band led by Lonnie Knight, the late, great Lonnie Knight, out of Richfield, got a lot of airplay with their records. The Del Counts, who are still playing today, Charles Shane and his band. Most weekends you can find them, and you should, because they're still a lot of fun. And TC Atlantic, the band that Rod played with after the Underbeats. Mona was one of their hits. Live at the Bellray Ballroom is an album that I remember having back in the day that it was just a tremendous performance. Let's see, the Still Rovin' from Robbinsdale, I believe, with a cover of Hey Joe. And the Escapades. If you've read my book, or I can't take a lot of time to go into this story, but the Escapades were a St. Paul band that decided they were going to pretend to be from England. So they got long hair wigs, and they opened for Chuck Berry on New Year's Eve 1964. After having basically removed themselves from all of their friends and woodshedding for 2 or 3 months in the basement, learning all of these British songs. And they faked British accents, and they even had Chuck Berry convinced that they were from England. But the story is even better than that, but I don't have time to go into it. But eventually they were found out. Somebody pulled off one of their wigs, and the story crumbled. But they had a member of the band in the Escapades named Enrico Rosenbaum, who was a wonderful guitar player and a great songwriter and singer. And when Jim Johnson of the Underbeats ended up going to Vietnam in 1966, he recruited some other players to come and take his place while he was gone. And Rico Rosenbaum was one of them, and Tom from the Accents. Name has escaped me, Rod. Tom. Well, no, he was the guitar player for the Escapades, but the Accents. Yeah, Tom Nystrom, right. Drummer for the Accents, ended up joining the Underbeats as well. Oh, and also James Walsh from the Hot Half Dozen. So that was a absolutely loaded band when they had those 3 join them. And the Underbeats recorded some original songs. But the thing is, in 1967, the airplay was starting to disappear for the local bands. I think this record, It's Gonna Rain Today, was one of the best things I've ever heard recorded in the Twin Cities, but it didn't get any chart action whatsoever. And by the time Jim Johnson came back from Vietnam, he was already thinking, well, this scene may be played out. Might be time to go someplace else. Meantime, the Electras from Ely, Minnesota, recorded Action Woman, which was a pretty successful song, and the recording scene had moved more to Dove Studios in Bloomington. K-Bank was sold a little bit later on, and Dove was pretty much where the remaining hit records came from. The Litter recorded there. They also had a couple of hits that got played on the radio. Zippy Kaplan from the Escapades ended up moving to the Litter, and then White Lightning. Lonnie Knight ended up in Joker's Wild, and they played. They did a power trio thing, so you can see that the music was really starting to change. And quickly, just to go back and point out what Joker's Wild was wearing at the time. This is how fast tastes had changed in the local rock scene from, say, 1962 or 3, when a lot of bands were still wearing coats and ties, until 1968, when just the wilder the better is what they were wearing. Nickel Revolution had a sort of a bubblegum hit, and that was even an indication that the music scene itself, styles and tastes, were really changing. The Underbeats ended up going to Los Angeles in 1969 and changed their names to Gypsy, and recorded a very successful double debut album. And they remained out on the West Coast and recorded 3 or 4 more albums after that into the early 70s. Meanwhile, South 40 was an amalgam of several local bands. They had a hit. Denny Craswell from the why am I blanking on this? Liar Liar Castaways, yes, of course, Castaways. Denny ended up joining a couple of other local musicians in the band Crow, which you may remember from their hit Evil Woman in 1970, I think that was. And that's pretty much where my story ends, because in 1970, the scene had changed so much. There was so little local airplay. The teen dances were pretty much over with. The bands were moving into the bars or leaving town. But that's the story of 60s rock and roll as I see it in Minnesota. And I want to turn it over to Andrea. Thank you.
Hello, nice to meet you all. I'm really happy to be here. And I could talk about this eternally, so I'll try to be brief with the research that I did for this book. But tonight I'm going to be talking about a book that I first released in 2017, came out on paperback in 2021. So throughout the years, I've actually learned a lot more about this, and would be happy to keep the conversation going and answer questions that might come up too. So the book is called Got to Be Something Here, The Rise of the Minneapolis Sound, and much like Rick's book, it covers a pretty wide era of time in the Twin Cities scene, but it's really specifically focused on, am I feeding back? Or am I the only one that's hearing that? Really specifically focused on the Black music community in the Twin Cities, specifically artists that were making R&B, soul, and funk music in the 60s and 70s. And you may be wondering, oh, how did I get interested in this? What could have inspired this? And the answer, like so many things in Minnesota music, is Prince. I'm a huge Prince fan. I've covered him for most of my career as a music journalist here in town. I was lucky to see many concerts out at Paisley Park and cover them and interview him and just become a regular in his orbit for the final years of his life. And I spent a lot of time thinking about him and his relationship to Minnesota and what he means to us here for our music scene and all that came before and after him. This screenshot is taken from his television debut back in, I think it was January 1980 that it aired. Prince was on American Bandstand. And the reason that he's making this face is because Dick Clark just asked him, "This isn't the kind of music that comes out of Minnesota, is it?" And I think that quote is such a perfect encapsulation of what drives me crazy about the way people talk about Prince, which is like he was the only Black person that ever lived in Minnesota, and that it was a total anomaly that anyone making R&B infused music, which he was at the time, would have come from here. And you can kind of see why, because this is the most recent national coverage that we had, which is, that we are a state of very well-meaning Scandinavians, white people, that, dominate this culture and that left little to the imagination about what other things could be happening here. So as I started digging more into this history, I started kind of basing my research around Prince and his upbringing and then slowly zooming the lens out to see what we were missing from this narrative about Minnesota music. So I started learning more about his peers in the music scene, like Jimmy Jam, and his longtime partner, Terry Lewis, who were both active starting in the 1970s. Not to get way too onto a tangent, but Jimmy Jam actually started, I've learned recently, playing in his father's band. He was a drummer for Cornbread when he was 12, and they were playing at these supper clubs out in Lake Minnetonka. So he has a very rich history of being active in the scene in all different kinds of ways, starting back then. 1973 is when Jimmy and Terry met each other at the Upward Bound program at the University of Minnesota. And they've now had a musical partnership that's lasted for 50 years. They just celebrated that milestone this summer, which is really incredible. So I started learning about them, and then I started learning about their peers, like Cynthia Johnson, who's seen here fronting the band Lips Inc. This is one of the only times I ever performed live. And of course, you know Lip Sync from their single Funky Town. I've gotten to interview a bunch of people that were involved with the making of that hit, and I always thought it was about Minnesota and Minneapolis being Funky Town and how we were just such this cool happening place. But Cynthia here is actually holding a suitcase because the song is about needing to get out of here and go somewhere much more cosmopolitan and interesting. So, you know, my heart was broken. I've never heard the song the same way again. But she was a huge force in local music in the 70s, a peer of Jimmy and Terry and Prince's. And I knew I needed to know more about her. And then I started tracing back, and I realized that just immediately preceding that whole generation of kids that we associate with the Minneapolis Sound was all of these amazing funk bands that were active in the early 70s. This is a band called Prophets of Peace. And they had a lot of peers in that era, like Hayes, who put out a great record and had a kind of a minor hit in 1974. And so then I kept digging back further, and I got to the late 60s and realized there were all these R&B, like hot acts playing at clubs. This is Maurice McKinney's playing at, I think this one was taken at the Cozy Bar. And I even got all the way back to the late 50s and realized that there were these teen bands in certain, basically like high schools playing dances that were already making R&B music around the period that Rick's research also began. So this is a really longer prehistory than I was anticipating, and it goes back and back and back the further that you trace it. I got all the way back to what I believe is the first R&B record to ever be recorded in the state of Minnesota. It was recorded by the gentleman that you see here. His name is David Hursk. He was a teenager at North High School in the 50s, and he was a very enterprising young man. He was really interested in audio, and he ended up purchasing a lot of audio equipment and outfitting his basement to become a very, very rudimentary recording studio. And so because he was advertising, you know, to his fellow students, he ended up, and because he was in North Minneapolis, where there was a small but growing black population, he just ended up, you know, coincidentally capturing some of these sounds just as they were starting to emerge. So I'm going to play you a little clip here of the song by the Big M's called Silent Lover. We'll see if we can hear it. So this band, the Big M's, I became really fascinated by them, and I ended up figuring out that it was a band of brothers. There were actually several different brothers that were part of this group, and as each one got older and graduated from high school, they would just recruit the next young brother that was coming into high school to play. So there ended up being like 6 different guys from this band, from this family, the Munsons, who were part of this group. This is some of their yearbook photos that I tracked down. And I ended up figuring out that one of them was still alive when I started doing my research, Lamar Munson. And I called him up totally out of the blue one day, and I asked if he would talk to me about his band, the Big M's. And he said, "No one has asked me about that group for 50 years. Who are you? What do you want? Like, what is going on?" And then I felt like, okay, I'm on the right track. I'm finding history that I am so fascinated by that is totally undocumented. And I was really interested in capturing some of these stories while the people who lived to experience them were still alive and get them into something, and it ended up being this book. So that's the story of the Big M's, and that's basically where the start of my research, I kind of had to choose a point to not keep going back further and further. That's where the book starts. And the thing that I also really liked about the year 1958 and this record coming out is that is the year that Prince was born. So it all works out. So as I started researching, I started digging through newspaper clippings and different archives that I could find at the Historical Society and at the Minneapolis Public Library. One thing that was really striking to me right away is that there was hardly any media coverage of any of the musicians that I was interviewing, which shouldn't be surprising given the segregation and institutional racism that exists in all places, including Minnesota. But it was really interesting to see who was written about and when and where. And one of the first mentions that I found of this kind of burgeoning R&B scene was a mention of this club, King Solomon's Mines. So I got really curious about learning more about that. And I'll zoom in on the picture. It's an incredible picture of one of the bands performing at King Solomon's Mines. And I just love everything about this, including the fact that there's like weird bamboo walls and this guy's laid on the floor. And I just needed to know more about what was going on here. So what I learned about King Solomon's Mines is that it was in the first level of the Fauché Tower, which is actually where Keys is now. And I've gone into Keys a bunch of times and I've tried to figure out where the stage was, but I think it's just completely different the way it's laid out now. But it was a very brief but very important space for black music in the late 1960s, and it was run by a man who you can see here named Dean Constantine. Dean and his wife actually ran a dance studio in town for decades, up until he passed away a few years ago. And so he just got interested in music and making a space for music, and was just genuinely interested in R&B music and did not realize that he was opening a huge can of worms by trying to open basically a black music club in downtown Minneapolis in 1967. Unsurprisingly, his club was raided all the time. There was a lot of claims that he was either serving to underage drinkers, which he was adamantly not doing, that he was, having all these issues in his club that he wasn't able to control. And at the time, there was this, what was called the Flying Morals Squad, a contingent of the Minneapolis police who had been tasked by the mayor to go around downtown Minneapolis and clean up anything deemed immoral, which opened, this huge gray area where they could crack down on anything that they basically didn't like, and started targeting clubs that were hosting black music. I ended up contacting the city council because this issue kept escalating with this club. It was only open for like 18 months, and they had nothing but trouble from the city. And I actually found a petition that the musicians that were playing at the club signed. It goes on for 20 pages. They had scans of it in the city council archives. I love that it's on the King Solomon's Mines crazy stationery. And it even had members of the local media at the time, members of the Minnesota Vikings signed this petition. And it just really showed how important this space was to the cultural community and just how targeted it was by the city at the time. The one positive thing that came out of this saga of King Solomon's Mines is that it was the first time that this issue of racism in the Minnesota music scene was actually discussed in the media. This came out in, I think it was 1969. So it's unfortunate that the first time that black music was really documented in our local media scene was because of racism, but it did start a conversation about what was going on and what could be done to try to make things a little bit more even in the local music scene. I'm going to just share a quote from this article that I thought was interesting, that most club owners agree that there's this definite, if unwritten, segregation policy that keeps black bands out of downtown clubs. And if you talk to musicians today, they're still adamant that this is an unwritten policy in certain clubs, certain spaces, certain parts of the city. I even talked to some people that had heard kind of secondhand from police that they were specific in even the borders of the areas of where they wanted black bands to play. And if you were within certain borders and you had more than 2 black people in your band, they were going to go after that club. So it was really a consistent story that I heard from musicians that I interviewed who played over more than 20 years in this time period. And it was just all at the hands of this Minneapolis Police Department Flying Morals Squad. Yikes. So in this research, I kept getting more interested in kind of this social dynamic that was playing out and how it associated with the music scene. And I started researching a place called the Way Community Center. And the first thing that I learned about the Way is that it was formed in the immediate aftermath of unrest that broke out in 1967, not unlike the unrest that we all experienced in 2020. And this picture really caught my attention, and I'm going to zoom in on it here. And I was going through microfilm at the time. The papers hadn't been digitized yet and put online. And I was like, what is this a picture of? It is a picture of a bunch of teenagers standing outside out on Plymouth Avenue immediately following a summer of unrest. And the National Guard is rolling through, as we just all saw again. And I was really interested in this caption. Teenagers gathered in front of the Way Community Center for a street dance. The dance, chaperoned by parents of neighborhood youth and Way officials, was described as jovial. You wouldn't know it from the picture, but they had a great time. So I really wanted to know more about what was the Way and how does it relate to all of this unrest that was going on. Here's another clearer picture that I ended up finding so you can see more detail. So the Way sat on Plymouth Avenue, and as I mentioned, it was opened in the immediate aftermath of the unrest in 1960, I want to say actually 66, because then it happened again in 67. And what happened is a bunch of community members got together and realized that there were just so many needs in this specific part of the city that were not being met, including young Black people having trouble finding jobs, the streets and parks not being maintained or cleaned up, educational problems, social problems, you name it. They had a community meeting and they came together and decided what could help to address some of these problems is if they had a space. And they took over this building that used to be, I think, a fishing store, and they opened this very kind of DIY community space. They put a receptionist at the front desk, they got a phone, and they started trying to get people jobs. It's basically how it started. And then as things started getting a little bit more formalized, they started having a board, they started taking donations. They got some actually very prominent white business people of the time to donate money to try to support this kind of fledgling operation. And by the late 60s, they actually had classes that you could take if you were a young person in the neighborhood. They had social programs like the street dances. And they even had a music room, which I'll get to in just a moment. I want to share one really amazing picture that I found as I was researching the unrest and the Way. These are actually all members of the Way holding hands to keep white supremacists from driving through North Minneapolis to take advantage of the situation during the unrest in 1967, which obviously echoes what just happened all over again. But what just to get back to music, like what does all this have to do with anything? The huge influence that the Way ended up having was that they were offering a music program and they were hosting concerts and they were really trying to provide a safe, positive space for young people in the neighborhood to come and learn how to play instruments, to form their own bands. They even had a leader, Spike Moss, who you can see here introducing the band, who became kind of their de facto manager and was booking shows for them, booking little regional tours for them, and really teaching this whole generation of young people how to be a professional musician. And the music that was coming out of the Way at the time was just incredible. This is a picture that there was a band called The Family. One of the members actually found this in his scrapbook. Thank you. I love when people don't throw things away. So what this is capturing is actually outside the Way, as you can tell, because the stage was set up outside of the exterior wall. And they would have these Battle of the Bands showcases where the kids would all come together and compete basically for notoriety. I asked several of the musicians that I interviewed, were there cash prizes? Or were you winning studio time? And they're like, no, we just wanted to be the coolest. It was just for claps, basically, is what they were competing for. So there was this band that came out of the Way called The Family. They became kind of the de facto house band, and they were led by a musician named Sonny Thompson, who, if you are a fan of Prince's NPG, now goes by Sonny T. He still plays every Monday night at Bunkers as part of Dr. Mambo's Combo. He's a huge force in the local music scene, and he was kind of the guiding light for this whole generation of young men that were hanging out at the Way. He was a couple years older than Prince and Morris Day and Andre Simone and Jimmy Jam, and they all really looked up to him. When I interviewed Jimmy and Terry for this book, they talked a lot about how cool and terrifying the family were. They were so good, and they were a little intimidating and a little threatening, and but in like a cool way. And everyone looked up to Sonny Thompson, as he was known at that time. And of course, one of the people that was inspired by Sonny was Prince. Prince hung out at the Way when he was a young person. This is about how old he would have been when he started going to the Way. And this was about how old he would have been when he was gigging in his band at the time and playing some of these Battle of the Bands showcases in his group Grand Central. This is one of the only known pictures of Grand Central. I've been told that they were actually photographed quite a lot and that Prince kept all of the pictures and wouldn't let anyone else have them. So theoretically, they're somewhere in Paisley Park. But I don't know if we'll ever get to see them. This is the one shot that we have. So in this band are siblings Linda and Andre Anderson, and they're actually all standing outside of their home. Next to Andre is Morris Day. Next to Morris is Terry Jackson, who lived next door, Prince, and then a young man named William Doty. And they were the talk of the town in the mid-'70s in the teen scene, along with their musical peers at the time. So Morris Day joined the group in 1974, so that's probably around when this picture was taken. And they would play all of the school dances, and they would play Battle of the Bands showcases. And I've even found advertisements for them playing on a soul cruise on one of the Jonathan Paddleford riverboats, which is amazing. And then I once interviewed Andre Anderson, who became Andre Simone. We did a live session at the State Fair for my former employer, The Current, and Andre just kind of dropped as we were talking, that Prince and he and the rest of Grand Central played the State Fair when they were teenagers. I was like, wait, what? Prince played the State Fair. And they were like, yeah, the Andre's mom and Morris's mom would just call around and find opportunities and book them all throughout the Twin Cities. So they ended up playing a ton of places. So I got really curious about if they were playing high schools, maybe I could find more pictures of them. And I started scouring the yearbooks in the Minneapolis Public Library for this time. And I did find one picture. And of course, this is Andre and Linda playing, and Prince is out of frame. So he did not make the cut for the yearbook photographer who was capturing this event. But this is at South High School, Grand Central playing probably a homecoming or a prom back in the 70s. I love the story of Andre and Prince and how this whole band formed. I've gotten to interview Andre many times, but the first time I interviewed him, he drove me around North Minneapolis and he showed me all of these different places where he and Prince used to hang out. And he showed me the apartment where Prince's dad lived, where he and Prince actually went to jam for the first time after meeting in 7th grade on the first day of school. And during that little jam session, I think Andre said he was playing like a little ukulele style like bass, trying to play bass lines, and Prince was playing piano and his father's piano and guitar. Andre looked at the piano and said, "That picture looks so familiar to me. Who is in this picture?" And Prince said, "Oh, that's my father. He's playing in his jazz group, the Prince Rogers Trio." And Andre said, "But that's my dad playing bass." Which I think means that they were predestined to be together and to make music. But also speaks to how they emerged from this scene that was already happening long before them. Prince's father was a very active gigging musician starting in the 50s. He was in this group, Prince Rogers Combo, Prince Rogers Trio, performing as the stage name Prince Rogers, which he would eventually give to Prince for his name. And I just love knowing that it's all connected as part of this lineage, and that everything just seems like it was leading to, Prince emerging, into all this music emerging and eventually making its way out of North Minneapolis and into the world. So like I said, I could go on a lot about this. I'm going to try to wrap it up here. But the conclusion that I came to, one of many conclusions that I came to in my research and learning more about kind of the social dynamics that shaped this place, is that I believe it also shaped the sound. I believe that when you're hearing Prince's music, you're hearing the music of a person that was born in a specific time in a specific place, who was deeply aware of the racism and segregation in his hometown, and who really constructively sought to break through all of those barriers with his music and with his business and with every way that he presented himself to the world. So I'll leave you with a picture of Prince playing First Avenue in March of 1981. He, at this point, had already released a couple albums, had done a couple tours, but had really yet to be embraced here in his hometown. They didn't really play Prince on the radio in Minnesota until Little Red Corvette, which came out in 1982 off of his fifth album. But this was a moment when Prince performed for a mostly white, hipster, let's be honest, audience of young tastemakers who really were impressed by what they saw and fully embraced him. And the fact that he was playing at First Avenue, this really cool club in downtown Minneapolis with a mixed race band, playing music that combined, all of the influences that he grew up with, R&B and funk and soul music, and also, all the emerging punk and new wave, and combining it into something new. I just feel like it's such a triumph and such a great crystallization of his experiences and what he really meant for everything that came after. So I will leave it there.
Does anybody have any questions? Oh, my husband.
It's more of a comment. I was talking to Andrea about this earlier.
Yeah.
I read her wonderful book several years ago, and the thing that frustrated me was the reference to all these really rare records, because they're pretty obscure. And if you don't have $100 and find them on eBay, you can't get them. But I found out they're all on YouTube. So if you read the book with your phone, you can listen to the songs as you're reading them. And I'm sure you can do that on Rick's book also, so that's a tip. And I have a question for Rick. There's no mention of Eddie Cochran.
No, Eddie was born in Minnesota, but he did not grow up here.
Okay.
So he's a native, but he really had no contribution to what was happening in the Minnesota rock and roll scene.
Hi, this question is for Rick. In 1979, when WWTC became the Golden Rock and started playing oldies, they played a lot of local gold. This is for Rick. What were your memories of WWTC as an oldie station at that time, and their contribution to the local music scene by playing some of the artists that were popular in the Twin Cities in the 1960s?
Well, I don't know how frequently you listen to WWTC, but for about a year and a half, I was on a weekly radio show there along with Arnie Fogel, who I'm sure many of you know. And I think it was sort of a rotating cast of other critics. And we would all bring records in. And this was sort of their one attempt to remain somewhat current. I remember bringing in a Smokey Robinson solo album that was current at the time. But every week we would all bring in something that we wanted to play. But that was, I think, a 1 or 2 hour segment on Sundays. Otherwise, everything that they played was oldies from the 50s, 60s, and probably into the 70s. I thought it was a wonderful station. It was AM. The sound wasn't as good as the FM stations, but the music obviously. I believe that this was before Cool 108 established itself in the market. So that was pretty much the only radio station you could listen to those songs anymore. And I sort of date myself now by knowing that Cool 108 came in playing the same format, and now their oldies format is hits of the 90s and 2000s and 2010s.
Another question for Rick. How prevalent was it for other bands to have the British copycat influence? It seems so silly to me.
Well, you'd think that when we talk about the bands we remember best from the mid-60s, that they were all influenced by the British invasion. but Rod can tell you that they were all playing years before they'd ever heard of the Beatles. But once the Beatles hit, they all quickly adjusted their set lists. They had to learn the British songs. The frequent playing of stuff by, say, Jerry Lee Lewis and even Buddy Holly became less and less frequent, whereas you had to play the Rolling Stones, and you had to play the Animals, and you had to play the Beatles. So they were all just hugely influenced. But I always need to point out that isn't what kicked off Minnesota's rock and roll boom. They were already playing by then.
I have a question on, interestingly enough, another radio question. Did you run into, and this is for you, the KMOJ? I was wondering if you had any input on what role KMOJ played back in that time. As a young person in the late 70s, we were able to barely get KMOJ in Hopkins. And my older sisters loved Earth, Wind & Fire and Stevie Wonder and Prince's first album, so my older sister introduced that album to me. And the second part, if I may ask, what were some of Prince's influences by name of the funk bands in Minneapolis? Which ones was he connected to, or did he admire?
Those are great questions. So on the radio point, the first radio station that really serviced North Minneapolis was KUXL, which is an AM station, and that only broadcast from dawn to dusk. And they had one DJ that played music for like 6 hours a day, and then the rest of the time was mostly like religious programming. So you had to really know, you had to be within a mile of where it was transmitting, and you had to know what time of day to tune in to find that. And that was mostly in the 60s and I think a little bit in the early 70s. KMOJ didn't go on air until as probably around the time that you were tuning in, the mid to late 70s is when they became formalized as a radio station. There, of course, became a huge force in Prince's career in the 80s. He would actually give Q Bear, the drive time host, copies of records to debut on air or test out on air, because he wanted to hear how it sounded. So they had a great relationship once he had already kind of gotten famous. But in the 70s, Prince told me, actually, randomly, the one time I got to talk to him one-on-one, we talked about this, he mostly listened to KQRS. So I think that also influenced him to be really eclectic with his, sonic palette. And he talked about listening to like Maria Muldaur and Joni Mitchell and Santana, and it just opened his ears to a lot of that style of what at the time was really like genre-less music coming out of the KQ airwaves. And then with bands that he was influenced by, so I haven't found a ton of evidence of him like talking about a lot of these bands, but there's a lot of anecdotes about, for example, like Wee Willie Walker used to play this club called the Nakarima in South Minneapolis on 4th Avenue South and 38th Street. It was basically a house, but it was like a kind of BYOB little venue where you could find bands playing, and Prince did go there and saw Wee Willie Walker, so I know that he was exposed to it. I know that Prince and Andre used to go to the Flame, which is another fascinating venue down on Nicollet and 15th that was active starting in the 40s as a country western venue. But by the 70s, to try to expand their clientele, they opened a disco room in the back, and they started having funk bands come in and play. So Prince and Andre used to kind of surreptitiously go there, even though their mom didn't want them to because it was a little bit seedy. But that was another place where he would have seen Prophets of Peace. He saw a band that ended up being called the Philadelphia Story, but they started out as the Valdons, which was like a 4-part harmony funk band. They're fantastic. They put out records in the early 70s. Some of them have been reissued, and they actually all got together and played my book release. So there's some video on YouTube of them playing at the Fitzgerald Theater in matching electric blue suits. It was just amazing. The Valdons. Yeah, so definitely look them up. And then one that I know Prince was really inspired by was a DJ on KUXL in the 60s named Jack Harris. And he, in Prince's words, he mentioned him at his Piano and a Microphone show, which is his final show he gave at Paisley Park in early 2016. He said Jack Harris was so funky, he even had his own band. And Jack Harris used to lead a band, and he even put out a couple records and was part of this label called Black and Proud Records, which put out some of these R&B singles in the late 60s. So Prince was definitely tuned into that, and they put out Maurice McKinney's, and I'm sure he knew about all of that. I just haven't found a lot more of him actually talking about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just have a comment. I'm 73 graduate of Southwest, still live in the neighborhood. Couple things. You didn't mention Willie and the Bees, and I would think Prince would have heard him, like at the 400 bar. They were there forever, and Willie Murphy. Also, there was a lot of good local cover bands that were not so much Beatle copiers, but they were soul copiers. The soul scene, Sam and Dave, Wilson Pickett. There's one called The Rare Breed when I was in junior high, which would have been the late 60s. And several of those members went on with the citywide high school jazz band that started the Wolverines. And they're a big band for years in the area, and still playing as a small group. But there was a lot even in Linden Hills going on. That was rock and roll. Some really good cover bands.
Talk about Willie and the Bees.
I have a chapter in the book about Willie and the Bees. Yeah, because the way that I was kind of tracking my research in the way I was writing it is that in the early 70s is when some of these, barriers between the black and white music communities started to gradually dissolve. It took a long time for those barriers to be fully broken, but Willie and the Bees were one of the first really popular interracial bands. And I talked at length to Maurice Jaycox, who was one of the main members of the band back in that time and still was playing with Willie up until his death a few years ago. And he had some amazing stories about being in that band. I found some incredible magazine articles from the Inbeat magazine, I think, and then there was another one, Connie's Insider magazine. They did a spread boozing with the Bumblebees about their hard partying ways and everything. So definitely a huge influence to a lot of bands and had their part in breaking down some of those barriers too.
Good evening. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Now I have two questions. One's for Rick and one's for Andrea.
Okay.
So we'll start with Rick. My question to you is, now, other than the Andrews sisters, in your research, were there any other girl groups that you knew of coming from the Twin Cities?
There were. None of them recorded, and that was usually my my sort of bar to really follow up on more research. But the 19th Amendment was a popular all-girl band. Well, I guess they were girls at the time. And let's see. I'm sorry, I know of at least two other ones, and they're just escaping me right now. But in terms of why they didn't make the book, it's only because I was more or less limited to bands that made records that people would still remember today. And in the case of the all-girl bands, I didn't find any of their recordings. So they probably deserved a mention. But then again, I've heard from other bands that did record that I didn't mention, and they're pretty cheesed off at me too. So that kind of thing happens.
Thank you, Rick. Andrew, my question is, as someone who was part of that sound scene back in the day, I want to know if during your research you came across groups like Sounds of Blackness.
Yes.
I'm an original member of the Sounds.
Wow.
And groups like Flight Time and 4x4 and Pepe Willie.
Yes. Definitely.
Definitely caught my attention because he, as part of the Sounds, we did some of the same gigs around the area along with the groups and stuff.
Oh, I'm sure.
Pepe Willie, I know, is called the godfather of the Minneapolis Sound.
Yes, yeah, one of Prince's early business mentors and kind of champions. And I think he got into Prince's life through one of his cousins. I forget the story.
He did.
Yes. But yeah, he even offered his home as a rehearsal space. I've heard stories about the band rehearsing 12 hours a day at his house, which is incredible. Huge supporter of Prince in his early career. Thank you for mentioning him.
Another question, comment. You both mentioned Cornbread Harris. He still plays. He plays every Sunday at Palmer's Bar in Cedar. I think it's called Church of Cornbread from 5 to 7. You want to be sure you get the music at here at 6 because sometimes it takes a while.
Andrea's got a book coming out about him. She's been working on that for a couple of years now.
Thank you for this amazing segue into what I'm doing next. Yes, it's true. I've been spending the last 2 years working on a biography of Cornbread, and it's been an amazing journey. I go to his house every Tuesday, and we hang out at his piano, and he tells me stories, and we've gone through scrapbooks and newspaper clippings. And in this experience of working on a book about his life, we've also gotten in touch with Jimmy Jam, his son, and I started working on the project at a time when they had been estranged for 50 years. And they're now back in communication and in touch. And Jimmy was actually at Palmer's 2 weekends ago with me watching his dad play. So they're in a really good place now. And he's been hugely supportive of the research that I've been doing and sharing a lot of stories about his childhood. And it's been really incredible. So that'll come out next year.
If Jimmy finishes the afterward.
Yes. We're waiting on Jimmy to hand in his afterward.
So will that be the U of M press again?
Yes. Yeah.
Any other questions that we'd like to ask and ask?